Hey everyone, we're going back to this. Anthony Fantano here, returning with another installation of Overrated and Underrated, where I go on Rate Your Music. I look through all the albums within a particular decade. I pick out one that I think is maybe inching a little higher ratings-wise than it really needs to be. And then after I kind of, go over why I think the record is being overpraised, I talk about an album that I think could use some more consideration over there. And in this episode, I'm talking about kind of a big one here, and that would be the Arcade Fire album Funeral. I know I'm about to commit some indie blasphemy here, but let's do it. Arcade Fire, legendary Canadian indie band known for their grand and whimsical sound, their numerous members, their layers of instrumentation. At least that's what the decade plus of music coverage and PR around the band would have you believe. And look, don't get me wrong, I think Arcade Fire has come out with a lot of very good albums over the years, some of which I have reviewed very positively. I still hold a lot of water for The Suburbs, for example, and for a long time too, as I was a passionate indie pop and rock and folk fan during my college years, Arcade Fire was one of many bands that I personally felt were pretty good. Maybe not my favorite band at the time. I was certainly more favorable to of Montreal and maybe Godspeed You Black Emperor, as well as Sufjan Stevens at the time, but there was really no reason to doubt the critical acclaim that Arcade Fire was receiving at the time of Funeral's release and for the years after it came out and sort of continued to snowball in popularity. But honestly, the streak of strikeouts Arcade Fire has been on as of late, with a lot of their new material getting worse and worse and worse with each album. This has kind of caused me to go back to their older stuff that I'd been listening to for years and see, kind of how it's aged. And yes, this included The Suburbs, which, again, I still enjoy. Neon Bible, of course. And most definitely their debut, Funeral, which when listening back to it, I just don't think is that good. And it's internally creating a bit of a crisis within myself. I feel like I'm learning that Santa isn't real or something, because if you know anything about this album, it's like, been pretty uniformly beloved for a long time, but kind of listening to it with more, I guess, experienced ears, I'm just not really hearing what is so captivating about it. The melodies and tunes throughout much of this record, in my opinion, are not that strong. During the moments where they are actually pretty sharp, they are often just super washed out with an overuse of reverb and not really as many stunning instrumental layers as you would expect from a band like Arcade Fire that has, that sort of like big band reputation that they do. To be direct about it, many of the instrumental palettes across this LP come across as very dull, very gray. What grandiosity there is, I think, comes down more to use of effects as opposed to layers of instrumentation. Comparatively, bands like Neutral Milk Hotel with freaking In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, or even Devotchka with their whole Romani folk, indie folk cabaret thing, with less members come through with way more lush and beautiful and stunning instrumental palettes than Arcade Fire does on this entire record. Maybe I'm just wanting more or expecting more, but even tracks on this thing that groove-wise still kind of rock, like Rebellion Lies, they just don't sound that big or as epic. And in comparison to a lot of the performances and instrumental displays on even The Suburbs, for example, just don't hit quite as hard. And what's worse is when there is actually a moment that does legitimately feel at least a little larger than life, like, the big vocal calls on the song Wake Up, those millennial whoops, as they are dubbed, would go on to influence so many awful, terrible, and trash music trends after the release of this album. I now associate that sound with just awful stuff, and just every terrible trendy band that came out of the woodwork work to put, on a show with like, yeah, we have like 28 members in our band. Isn't that epic? It's not, and your band sucked. So in a way, Arcade Fire kind of became a victim of their own success with this LP, in my opinion, as some of the simplest and most effective ideas just got ripped off into oblivion, quite mercilessly, I might add, and then, incorporated into records that had far more commercial appeal and frankly just pimped out the indie aesthetic for the charts. So again, in retrospect, it's my opinion here that this record, time has not been super kind to it, as the instrumental layers are not that interesting, they're not that intricate, they're not that colorful, they're not that dramatic or powerful. The performances aren't all that hard-hitting or fiery either. In fact, in comparison with a lot of the more kind of, big presentation indie acts out there, especially from Canada, Godspeed, hello. Arcade Fire's performances on here are maybe a little kind of mid-impact. Win Butler, don't really take anything away from him as a lyricist or a vocalist on this thing, but again, some of the best vocal performances on this thing are just a little too washed out. Lastly, I think one of this record's biggest inadvertent contributions to modern music is just the many, many, many indie cliches that so many other terrible artists took from it. And as a result of all of that, I think this record is kind of overrated. Now, you may agree, disagree, let me know in the comments. Let's flip it over to a record that came out around the same time, and I think on Rate Your Music is a bit underrated, and is currently sitting in I think the 3.3 score range, and that would be the self-titled debut album from The Evens, which is like this post-Fugazi music duo fronted by the one and only Ian MacKaye of Minor Threat fame, and obviously, again, Fugazi, Discord Records. Anybody who's familiar with punk and post-hardcore knows this guy, knows his cred, knows his contributions, but in the greater canon of his discography, I think this little at one time side project he was doing with Amy Farina has been sort of overlooked and not taken as seriously as it could have been. I think the low-key, very chill, post-hardcore energy being presented on this album it directly connects back to Fugazi's The Argument, their final album. So it's almost like Ian is kind of building off of that very great and classic record in a way, but stripping things back in a very minimal fashion on this LP, treating us to a series of songs that feel, again, part post-hardcore, part folk, part singer-songwriter, part indie rock and pop with the somewhat quaint boy-girl vocal layer-ups. The tunes on this record are just drums, guitar, vocals, what sounds like a series of live studio performances right to tape with minimal effects and overdubs and all that. And kind of the key to this record's somewhat unique sound for its style is the fact that Ian MacKaye is using a baritone guitar. So it's not like the riffs and the chords or guitar lines come off like super thin or crunchy or anything like that. There is a considerable amount of low end in the mix, but it's not being brought by bass. It's being brought by those lower strings on that baritone guitar, which Ian really rocks the hell out of throughout this record, making full use of its melodic range, getting not just chunky riffs out of the thing, but also springy chord progressions too. That guitar can only do so much though, as Amy Farina's drums do fill up a lot of the mix. She is really kind of like eating up that extra space on a lot of these tracks and doing it in a way that is nuanced, that is subtle, that is tasteful. Then on top of all of that, Ian and Amy's vocals, which again are doubled up on top of each other for a great deal of a lot of these songs, sound kind of sweet and cute and heartening, even if a lot of the time they are kind of dropping these tracks that are like semi-protest anthems or late-stage capitalist lamentations. It's a quiet album, it's a subtle album, it's very much a cerebral album, but it's still very much a beautiful and unique experience. And, even if this album isn't going to see the day on Rate Your Music where it is, rated like a 4.0 or something like that, I still don't know why it's not, kind of mentioned in the same breath as a lot of the great kind of like simple, raw, stripped-back rock duos that were popular during the 2000s. Your Black Keys, your Kills, and maybe obviously it's not as catchy as like a White Stripes album, but I think that even should be mentioned around that discussion. I mean, listen to All These Governors if you want like a quick taste of the, radical vibes this album is bringing forward. This radical but kind of chilled and laid back vibe. It's snappy as hell. It's fun as hell. It's thoughtful as hell. And frankly, on Rate Your Music, I think it's kind of underrated. I think that's going to be it for this segment. Over, under, there you go. Let me know what you thought of either of these albums if you've heard them. And I think I am going to leave it there. You're the best. Mwah. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, overrated, underrated, forever.